My name is Brunilda Rinaldi. I'm 32 now, but this story started 7 years ago, when I was still naive enough to believe in a happy ending. Back then, it seemed to me that life was being built up like a neat row of bricks, smoothly, reliably, firmly, with an obligatory crown in the form of family happiness. I lived in a small but cozy apartment on the third floor of an old house with cracked stucco, together with my fiancé Gaspard Reynolds. We had been together since college, and our 5-year history had woven us step by step into one whole, and I believed that I was building an unshakable foundation for our future. Gaspard was one of those men whose charm works instantly. He was tall, with dark, slightly curly hair, eyes the color of strong coffee, and a smile that made it easier to breathe. He worked as a financial consultant at a local firm, tinkering with numbers, graphs and reports from early morning until late at night, and I was just starting to make my way in marketing, eagerly seizing on any projects, trying to prove to everyone myself that I was worth something too. We weren't swimming in luxury, but we were comfortable, or something like that. A cramped kitchen, cups with chipped handles, endless shopping lists on the fridge, an old sofa on which we fell asleep together in front of the TV. Then it seemed to me that I didn't need more. I thought my family was my parents, Kyriaco and Gemma Rinaldi, and my younger sister, Ilaria. The difference of 3 years seemed insignificant, but there was always something more between us, almost imperceptible, but weighty. Ilaria was a favorite of her parents, and it was felt even in small things. From the very moment she was born, we grew up like a fast river and a quiet pond, side by side, but in different currents. My mother and I went to all her concerts, sports games, parent-teacher conferences, admired any success, and there was always some excuse when it came to my events. I got used to it. I learned not to get angry, not to be offended, only sometimes it seemed to prick inside subtly and imperceptibly, like a needle under the skin. When Gaspard proposed to me on our 5th anniversary, I was over the moon. Of course, we had discussed the wedding before, made plans, but when he got down on one knee in the living room, surrounded by flashing garlands and the smell of oranges, it still took me by surprise. I called my parents first. Mom answered right away, but there was a strange pause on the other end of the line. "That's wonderful, dear," she finally said, her voice flat, almost distant. "We should all get together and celebrate." I attributed her lack of enthusiasm to fatigue, evening, workday, business. But I was even more confused by Ilaria's reaction when I dialed her next. "Well, congratulations, I think," she said casually, and I felt the joy settle a little, like petals suddenly falling off in a glass vase full of water. "Thank you. I hope you'll be my bridesmaid." "Of course. I wouldn't miss it for the world." Gaspard and I decided to arrange a small wedding. Only close friends and family, 30 people at most. We were sure that we would save better on splendor, but we would invest more in the down payment on the house. It seemed reasonable and right. But when we got together with our parents to discuss our plans, we were in for a surprise. "We would like to pay for half of the wedding," Gaspard's mother said, smiling warmly. "And we'll pay for the other half," my father added. I almost choked on my coffee. My parents never offered to pay for anything significant in my life. My student loans, my first car, and the rent of an apartment were all on my shoulders. "Are you sure?" I asked cautiously, catching my mom's eye. "Of course, we are sure. It's your big day, Brunilda," she said, patting my hand. I probably should have noticed the first warning signs then. My father's slightly constrained smile, momentary tension on my mother's face, as if they were trying to keep some secret between them, but I was too carried away by this new feeling of generosity, support, and care. It warmed me up, lulled me, made me forget my previous grievances. Since the budget was no longer a problem, I decided to fulfill my long-held dream and fork out for a dress. I found it in a small boutique in the center of the city, with a showcase framed by garlands, with a crystal chandelier and the smell of vanilla in the air. The dress was gorgeous, A-line, thin lace sleeves, and a train that seemed to stretch all the way to the horizon. It cost more than I've ever spent on anything in my life, but when I put it on, I realized, this is it. I took him home to my parents, laying him out neatly in the back seat of the car, as if I were transporting a jewel. When I entered the living room, I saw Ilaria stretched out on the couch, listlessly flipping through the phone feed. She barely looked up when I crossed the threshold. "Hi," I said. "I brought a wedding dress. I wanted to show you." She looked at me. Boredom flashed across her face. I made an effort not to let her indifference poison this moment. When I carefully unzipped the bag and pulled out the dress, Mom gasped, pressing her palms to her cheeks, as if something sacred had appeared before her. "Oh, Brunilda, it's magnificent!" she exclaimed with sincere admiration in her voice, and for a brief moment it seemed to me that the light that I remembered from childhood lit up in her eyes again, when she proudly told the neighbors what a capable child I was. I unfolded the dress, holding it at arm's length, as if I were showing a rare jewel. The train flowed gently down, the lace shimmered in the evening sun that filtered through the curtains, and I turned to them, beaming. "Isn't it perfect?" I fell in love with him as soon as I saw him. The words hung in the air, and then I noticed how Ilaria's face turned a strange, painful shade, as if a green had slipped under her skin, like a shadow of envy, too old to hide it. "It must be nice when Mom and Dad pay for everything," she muttered, not even bothering to look up from the phone. I cautiously, almost mechanically, corrected. "They only pay for half of it. Gaspard's parents pay for the rest." Without deigning to say another word to me, Ilaria suddenly stood up abruptly, grabbed the phone and left the room, slamming the door with such demonstrative irritation, as if she had been insulted personally. "Don't pay attention to her cheeks," Mom said softly, shrugging her shoulders. "He's just jealous." I smiled back, even though the familiar feeling inside me was painful again, as if I were treading on thin ice, under which unspoken resentments had been bubbling for a long time. I carefully folded the dress back into the bag, smoothing out every crease, as if protecting it from evil eyes. "Ilaria has always been jealous of everything," I said in a low voice, not so much to her as to myself. "Always trying to outdo me. I remember getting an A in school, and she didn't sleep at night until she earned an A+. When I started dating Gaspard, she suddenly needed the captain of the football team. Everything should always be better, higher, louder." The following weeks passed in a flurry of preparation, and to be honest, my mother surprised me. Her enthusiasm was almost unstoppable. She called in the mornings, afternoons, and evenings, discussing flower arrangements, invitation options, menus, and seating arrangements. Sometimes it seemed to me that this was not my wedding, but her second youth. I just went with the flow, smiled, agreed, and didn't notice how time ticked off the last days until the date I'd been imagining for so many years. And only Gaspard was acting strangely. Sometimes he seemed to withdraw into himself, staring at the wall, not hearing my words, and when I asked if everything was okay, he smiled as usual and said that he was tired, that work was piling up, that the wedding needed attention. I believed it. I had to believe. A week before the celebration, Mom invited us to dinner. Gaspard was nervous. In the car, he turned on the radio, switched stations, but didn't seem to hear a single song. "Is everything okay?" I asked, touching his arm. He jerked it away as if he'd been burned. "Just setting up a wave," he muttered. When we arrived, Ilaria was already there. Her dress seemed too fancy for an ordinary dinner. When she saw Gaspard, she rushed to hug him and held him a little longer than was polite. I noticed the tension in his shoulders. Dinner was torture. My father kept clearing his throat, as if he was going to say something, but changed his mind. Mom was sitting with a strained, forced smile, and Ilaria. Ilaria looked at Gaspard as if they were exchanging some secret language known only to them. I tried to cope with the unpleasant feeling, but it stuck to my skin, tightened my chest, as if someone invisible was squeezing me in his arms. I excused myself and went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, peered into the reflection, hoping to find confidence there. But when I returned, my heart sank down, as if into a bottomless well. Ilaria was sitting next to Gaspard, their heads were almost touching, she was whispering and laughing, and he was. He didn't move away. Mom watched them with an expression of strange satisfaction, as if everything was going according to a plan she had long taken for granted. "What's going on here?" I asked, standing in the doorway of the dining room. Time stood still. All heads turned to me, but no one dared to speak first. Ilaria broke the silence first. "I think it's time to tell her, don't you?" she said, without taking her eyes off Gaspard. "Tell me what?" I demanded, feeling my voice tremble treacherously. She put her hand on Gaspard's arm. "Gaspard and I have been dating for 6 months now," she said slowly, with pleasure. "He loves me. Not you." I looked at Gaspard. I needed him to laugh, to tell me it was a ridiculous joke. But he was silent. Her eyes were on her plate, and her lips were white with tension. "Is that true?" I barely breathed out. He looked up. "I'm sorry, Brunilda. I didn't want this to happen." The room began to spin, the walls shifted, and the ceiling darkened. I gripped the back of the chair to steady myself. "So you decided to ambush me at a family dinner?" I whispered, looking around at the faces. My father averted his eyes, my mother sat with a cold, glass mask on her face. "The wedding is not cancelled," Mom suddenly said calmly. "We paid for everything. Ilaria will just take your place." The words hit me like a physical blow. They echoed in my head, deafening, knocking the air out of my lungs. I stood there, gritting my teeth, feeling the echoing silence pressing down on me from all sides, like a heavy, damp fog. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't believe that all this was really happening. "Are you crazy?" I finally managed to get out of myself, each word cutting my throat like glass. "You can't just replace me at my own wedding." Ilaria tilted her head slightly, squinted, and her lips stretched into that eternal, nasty grin of hers, which seemed to have been created specifically to destroy me. "It's not your wedding anymore, sis," she said softly, savoring every letter. "It's mine." I turned abruptly to my father. He has always been my last stronghold, my safe haven in a storm. I looked for support in his eyes, at least some glimmer of common sense, something to cling to. "Dad." He cleared his throat, avoiding eye contact with me, as if he was interested in anything but this scene. "Your mother is right," he said dully. "We've already paid for everything. It would be a waste of time to cancel now." "I don't care about the money," I shouted, clenching my fists so tightly that my nails cut into my palms. I was shaking. I wanted to throw myself across the table, rip that smug grin off Ilaria's face, swing and... "This is my wedding." His voice rose to a scream, trembling with betrayal and impotence. Gaspard looked up at me. Empty ones. Apologetic. Pathetic. "I'm sorry, Brunilda," he murmured, but his voice was no more than a whisper among the wreckage of my world. And suddenly everything became crystal clear. "Did you know all about it?" I asked, icy rage coursing through my veins with every word. "Is that why you offered to pay for the wedding, Mom? You planned all this, didn't you?" Mom froze. A second, maybe 2, is enough to figure out the truth. "Of course not," she said. But the pause between the question and the answer told me everything. "Why did you wait until a week before the wedding to tell me?" My voice was trembling treacherously, but I tried to hold on. Gaspard was silent, like a puppet devoid of his own words. And Ilaria shrugged her shoulders. Because he's too cowardly to tell you himself. I had to take matters into my own hands. I felt sick with disgust. I stepped back from the table, pressing my palm to my chest as if I could keep my heart from bursting. "I'm leaving," I said, turning on my heel. "Don't forget to leave the dress," Ilaria called after me. Her voice was light, almost melodious, as if she were talking about something ridiculously insignificant. "I'll meet him in it now." I ran out of the house without turning around. There were tears in my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. They blocked the road as I fumbled with the keys, barely getting them into the car lock. I drove, gritting my teeth, gripping the steering wheel, back to the apartment I still shared with Gaspard. The apartment I had to leave now, because the lease was in his name. But when I got there, I didn't cry. Anger boiled in his chest, spreading like lava, and there was simply no room for tears. I grabbed my suitcases and furiously began to sweep clothes, shoes, books, cosmetics into them. Everything that reminded me of a life that no longer exists. Then I saw the wedding dress. It hung on the closet door, white and immaculate, like a symbol of a dream that had just been stolen from me. I took the scissors. Without hesitation. Without a doubt. Section. Another segment. Silk and lace fell to the floor in patches, and each cut was an act of revenge. I didn't stop until there was nothing left, just the pathetic rags that I threw around the bed, the one where Gaspard and I fell asleep, laughing, planning the future. I called Kate. "Can I stay with you for a while?" "Of course," she replied, and there was so much warmth in her voice that I almost lost my temper. "What happened?" "You sound terrible." "I'll tell you when I get there." "Come here." "I've arrived." I spent the night on her couch, choking on sobs until my voice broke, until the tears ran out. Kate was sitting next to me, holding my hand, bringing me tea and napkins, but I didn't want to drink, talk, or think anything. As the first rays of the morning sun pierced the room through the blinds, Kate asked softly, "What are you going to do now?" "We should write to everyone invited," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "To tell them that the wedding is cancelled." With shaking fingers, I sent a massive email. "Due to unforeseen circumstances, the wedding between Gaspard Reynolds and me will not take place. I apologize for any inconvenience." The answers came immediately. Friends wrote words of support, asked what happened, offered help. But the worst of all were letters from relatives. "Your mother said that the wedding will take place anyway. But Ilaria is now a bride." "What's going on, Brunilda?" I turned off the phone. I couldn't take it anymore. The next day, I went to work, only to hide behind the usual tasks, to go into a routine where no one knew what kind of wreck had happened in me. When I entered the office of Tom, my boss, I met his attentive gaze. "Brunilda, what happened?" "What is it?" he asked, putting down the papers. I told him everything. The words came out of my mouth non-stop, one after the other, in a hurry, as if I was afraid that if I stopped talking for even a moment, reality would close over me again, closing in a steel loop, not allowing me to take a breath. I spoke without choosing expressions, without caring about decency. I poured out everything, every meanness, every betrayal, every sarcastic smile of Ilaria, every empty look of Gaspard, every chilling phrase of my mother, which cut like a knife through memory, nerves, and heart. When she finished, there was silence. Tom, my boss, just stared at me for several long seconds, and I could tell by the look on his face that he was going over in his mind the words that could contain all the horror of what he had heard. But there weren't enough words. "These people don't deserve you," he finally said, and his voice was as hard as granite. "But I might have a solution." He said that the company is about to open a new branch on the other side of the country. They need someone with experience, brains, and ambition to start the whole process from scratch. The package included relocation assistance, a decent salary, and most importantly, freedom. The freedom to leave. The freedom to start with a clean slate. "It's yours, if you want," Tom added, and there was no pity or regret in his eyes, just respect for the fact that I stood in front of him without breaking down. "When can I start?" I asked, and my voice was calm, as if I had made this decision long before his proposal. "How about next week?" And I agreed. The day before Ilaria and Gaspard's wedding, I was already on the plane. I was carried away from the city, from the streets that knew my steps, from the houses that remembered me as a teenager, from the shadows of the past that would now haunt my every look, every breath. The company rented a cozy furnished apartment for me, and I arrived light, just clothes, documents, some books, and photographs. Everything else was left there, among the scraps of lace and ashes. My job was my salvation. I was drowning in it, agreeing to projects that no one wanted, staying the longest, arriving before anyone else, checking, clarifying, recalculating, rewriting. Tom noticed it, and he liked it. 6 months later, I was offered a promotion. A year later, the next one. The salary grew, the respect grew, the confidence in one's own abilities and in one's own decisions also grew. 3 years later, I signed a contract to buy my apartment. Not with anyone. Not with Gaspard. Not with someone's last name in the contract. Just me. Just my name. I made the initial payment and was happy with every figure in the bill, because I knew that it was my work, my strength, my sleepless nights. And when, 7 years after that horror, I paid off my mortgage in full, ahead of schedule, thanks to generous bonuses, it seemed to me that I could finally exhale. It was a world in which no one reminded me who Ilaria was, who Gaspard was, who my parents were. I didn't communicate with them. No one tried. Only Aunt Lucrezia, the only one who remained a neutral island in the sea of deception, called once a month. She came here sometimes. She never mentioned her family unless I started the conversation myself. And I rarely started. But on one of her visits, she broke the silence. "Ilaria gave birth to another one," she said carefully, as if probing the ground, checking how interested I was in general. "Now she has 3. "Good for her," I replied calmly. "She doesn't work," my aunt continued, nodding, as if this fact deserved special condemnation. "And your parents took over the business loans for Gaspard." I nodded, taking a sip of my coffee. "How nice of them." My aunt studied my face carefully, as if looking for traces of emotion, cracks in the mask of indifference. "You really don't care, do you?" "Really." And that was the truth. No anger. No revenge. Not a shadow of regret. They'd become nothing to me. Characters from an old book, the pages of which are faded, have flown around, and the plot has already been erased from memory. 7 years have passed. I lived calmly, confidently, and with pleasure from every day I lived. I didn't expect any more tricks. I wasn't afraid of night calls. I had friends, stability, and a job that I loved. I had everything I ever wanted. It was an ordinary Tuesday, a warm October day. I was sitting by the window with my laptop, looking through the reports, when the phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I almost switched to voicemail, but suddenly something stopped me. "Hello?" Pause. And then, "Brunilda. It's Mom. Please don't hang up on me. I know, I have no right to call. I know what we did was unforgivable. But please, just listen to me." I was silent. Silence fell between us, heavy and thick. A child's crying could be heard somewhere in the background. "It's not good, Brunilda," she continued when I didn't answer. "Very bad. Gaspard's business collapsed completely. The loans we took out for him cannot be repaid. The bank is threatening to take the house. A bitter smile involuntarily escaped my lips. And that should worry me. Ilaria and Gaspard lost their house 6 months ago, she said, as if she hadn't heard my sarcasm. They live with us. All 5 of them. It doesn't work, you know. And now Gaspard is out of work. No one takes him because of his reputation after the collapse. I was silent, listening to the walls of their cozy lies crumble. I'm still waiting for an answer, Mom said with forced calm. Why are you telling me this? I asked. I said it categorically, harshly, with a practiced coldness in my voice, but I already knew what would happen next. On the other end of the line, Mom took a deep breath, as if she was about to dive into icy water. We need help, Brunilda, she said softly, and there was that trembling note in her voice that I remembered from childhood, when she asked my father for forgiveness for some costly mistake. Financial assistance. I closed my eyes. Sure. Of course, it all came down to this. I work 2 shifts at the hospital, and your father. She paused, as if it was hard for her to say it out loud. He retired and got a job in a hardware store. But that's not enough. We can barely keep the lights on, and with 3 small children in the house. I was about to click hang up to tell her exactly where she could go with her problems, when suddenly an idea popped into my head. It's a damn perfect idea. I smiled, slowly, almost sensually, feeling the excitement of the thought spread through my body. Maybe I'm ready to help, I said, savoring every word. But on one condition. There was a tense pause on the other end of the line. What? Thanksgiving is in 3 weeks. I'll go back to the city and you'll have a big family dinner. Call everyone, Aunt Lucrezia, Uncle Paul, Grandma Rinaldi, all the cousins. A real family holiday. Of course. She answered hurriedly, hope creeping into her voice for the first time during the conversation. We will be glad. I'll invite everyone. You have no idea what that means. I hung up before she could finish. Putting down my phone, I leaned back in my office chair, staring out the window at the city that had become my home. My new home. A slow smile spread across my face. After 7 years, I'm finally going to achieve what I want. I will have my revenge. I spent the next 3 weeks carefully planning my trip. The hotel turned out to be exactly as the website promised, luxurious, but without too much pathos. Spacious room, snow-white linen, windows overlooking the park. After checking in, I took a long hot bath, ordered dinner in the room, and allowed myself to relax. I slept deeper than I had in the last few years. The next morning, on Thanksgiving, I got ready slowly. I didn't want to arrive too early. Let all the relatives be there. Let them have time to discuss my unexpected visit, to reflect on how they should greet me. At exactly 1600 hours, I drove up to my parents' house. I parked, but I wasn't in a hurry to get out. The house seemed strange. Peeling paint on the windows, sagging wooden steps, and a weedy courtyard that was once my father's pride. They've always been obsessed with appearance. On how they look to others. Based on what people think. And now the house betrayed their true situation louder than any words. I took a deep breath, grabbed my small purse, and headed for the door. I knocked. Mom opened the door. Her face lit up with a smile, but her eyes remained cold and tense. Brunilda. You came. She made a move as if she was going to hug me, but I stepped into the house without meeting her eyes. I promised I'd come, I replied in a flat voice. The house looked no better inside than it did outside. The furniture was the same as it had been in my childhood, but now it was shabby, with stains that the cheap bedspreads couldn't hide. Children's toys, some worn dolls, and cars with broken wheels were strewn across the living room floor. Children's voices could be heard from the depths of the house. Mom led me into the kitchen. Ilaria was standing there, setting the table. She looked up, and I saw a brief flash of displeasure in her eyes. Envy? An assessment? She ran her eyes over my clothes, my perfect hairstyle, and the designer bag. She's changed. She gained weight, her face looked haggard, and there were deep shadows under her eyes. Her clothes looked cheap, slightly worn. I smiled, slowly, with a subtle hint of pleasure. "Hi, Ilaria," I said in a perfectly polite voice. "You look tired." Her fingers gripped the fork so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Before she could answer, 3 children burst into the kitchen, followed by a man. It took me a moment to recognize him. Gaspard. He's aged a lot. His hair was thinning, and there was gray at his temples. The hairline has receded further than I thought. The extra weight that rounded out his once toned figure made him look awkward and tired. When he saw me, he froze like a deer in the headlights. There was a tense silence in the kitchen. My father came in, bent, gray-haired, and aged. "Brunilda. You did it," he smiled uncertainly. "Yes, I did," I replied, maintaining my pleasant, polite smile. I let them enjoy this moment. I let them take a good look at me, feel the difference. "You all seem busy," I said casually, looking around the fuss around the festive table. "Maybe I'll come back later." "No, no," Mom said quickly. "Everything is under control. The turkey is almost ready, the relatives will arrive any minute. Why don't you sit in the living room? I'll get you a drink." I nodded and headed there, feeling whispers coming from behind me. And I had barely managed to sit down on the battered sofa when the bell rang in the hallway, short but shrill, announcing the arrival of the first guests. It was repeated over and over again, and the house was filled with voices, laughter, creaking doors, and muffled hand claps during hugs. Within half an hour, the entire first floor was occupied by relatives. Those whom I hadn't seen in years passed by with short nods and strained smiles, while others with whom I maintained at least some kind of connection through Aunt Lucrezia hugged me with unexpected warmth, whispered how much prettier I was, how glad I was to see them after so many years. While everyone was sitting down at the long table in the dining room, Mom was bustling around handing out plates, Ilaria was running with trays, the children were making noise, turning over pillows on the couch, and I was silently watching this performance, in which I had once been just an extra character. Now, as if according to a script, the attention began to slip on me. Over dinner, my mother brought the conversation back to me over and over again. She would ask about work, then about the city, then about my apartment. Her voice sounded ordinary, but I could feel this intense urgency. It was as if she was trying to remind everyone who the main prize was here, who was the lifeline they hoped to cling to. I answered briefly, politely, and with restraint, as if we were discussing the weather forecast, making it clear that I was not interested in unfolding stories about my life in front of this audience. But it was enough for me to feel the growing irritation in Ilaria's eyes. She wasn't used to staying in the shadows, especially her older sister. Every glance, every word in my direction, every short laugh at the table was like a splinter under her skin. When dessert was brought out on the table, a pumpkin pie with slightly spread edges and dents from the packaging, Mom suddenly looked at me with a long, meaningful look. "Brunilda, is there something you want to say before we serve the pie?" Here he is. The very moment they brought me here for. The moment when I should have gracefully softened, remembered that family is more important than resentment, stood up and generously announced financial support, surrounded by approving smiles and relief. How wrong they were. I stood up slowly, ran my hands over my dress, smoothed out the invisible folds, raised my head and looked around the table. Dozens of eyes turned to me, curious, intense, indifferent, alert. The glances of the parents and Ilaria were full of feigned warmth, slightly narrowed expectation. Before we move on to dessert, I began in a flat, clear voice, so that the words penetrated into every corner of the room. I would like to thank everyone for coming today. It's rare to see everyone together. I paused, looking at Ilaria. Her face, as in a mirror, reflected the first glimmer of concern. We haven't been going for a long time. And, there was a reason for that. The reason, I think, is unknown to many of you. A slight wave of puzzled looks swept across the table. Embarrassment, rustling. Mom stood up a little, as if she wanted to seize the initiative, but I raised my hand. I was supposed to get married 7 years ago. I had a dress. The restaurant is booked. Invitations have been sent out. Even a list of gifts was made. It was supposed to be the beginning of a new life. I turned to my mom and continued without looking away. Then I was surprised that my parents suddenly showed such generosity, offering to pay for half of the wedding. After all, before that, frankly, they didn't care. A shadow appeared on the mother's face. I saw the corners of her lips twitch. But a week before the wedding, I found out the truth. The truth that many people in this room don't know. Then it turned out that my fiancé, Gaspard, was dating my sister. Silence hung over the table. Brunilda. My mother began, but I didn't let her continue. No, Mom. This is exactly the right time and place. I looked at the guests again. But an affair is half the trouble. The scariest thing was that my parents knew. They allowed it. Moreover, they decided that Ilaria would take my place. They hid it until it was too late, and then, at a dinner like this, they announced to me that the wedding would take place, just not with me. A whisper went across the table, as if a draft of wind swept through the room. Aunt Lucrezia, always silent, squeezed my hand, and this touch gave me the strength to continue. Then I left. Cancelled the wedding. And my mom told me that I didn't have the right to do that, because they had already paid. And then Ilaria called me and asked me to leave my dress for her. Some gasped. Others averted their eyes. Ilaria sat with clenched teeth, her fingers twitching convulsively on her napkin, and Gaspard looked down at his plate, as if he was ready to disappear. Instead of a dress, I left scraps. She cut it up and left. Forever. I looked around the table again. But here I am. Back with you. Thank you for dinner. Thank you for the opportunity to remind everyone of what happened. And know this, I didn't come back to forget. Silence filled the room, giving everyone time to digest what was said. And I stood in the middle of this paralyzed feast, realizing how easy the truth is when it no longer hurts. I didn't speak to any of them until the silence that followed my words became deafening. It was a special silence, not the kind that comes from awkwardness, or the kind that accompanies thoughtfulness, but the thick, viscous, dense silence of defeat, in which everyone sitting at this table was trying to figure out how to continue pretending as if nothing had happened. My father buried his face in his plate, as if his life depended on counting the potato pieces on it. Gaspard looked as if he would gladly fall through the floor, never to be on the surface again. His shoulders slumped, his chin dropped, and his eyes darted helplessly around the table, avoiding my gaze. Mom maintained an expression of controlled panic. The corners of her lips twitched tightly in a kind of smile, and her eyes, usually tenacious and clinging, darted from side to side, as if looking for a loophole to escape from her own living room. But I wasn't going to stop the performance. 3 weeks ago, I continued, as if flipping through a page in a long, forgotten novel, Mom called me. Almost everyone at this table became interested. I saw some people standing up, others froze with forks in their hands, and someone cautiously looked back at their parents. Gaspard's business has failed, I said as flatly as if I were reading the weather forecast. And with such a roar that it still echoes. The loans taken to maintain it did not save. Now my parents are about to lose their home. Ilaria, Gaspard and their 3 children live here because they have already lost their own. And you know what? They decided to ask me for help. 7 years later. I slowly opened my purse and took out a small white envelope. She unwrapped it and took out 5 brand new, crisp $100 bills. Under the eyes of everyone present, she carefully placed them in the middle of the table, as if making a symbolic contribution to the general bankruptcy. "This is what you deserve," I said, letting the words flow around the room, looking each of them in the eye in turn. $500. Not because they will really help you. And not because I care about you. I want you to understand how little your betrayals mean to me right now. Mom shuddered, and I saw how she clutched the napkin, as if it were a lifeline holding her over a precipice. Ilaria leaned back, her lips pressed tightly together, and the lights of the same anger that once fueled her betrayal danced in her eyes. Gaspard lowered his head completely, accepting it like a beaten dog. "I could have given you more," I continued with a soft grin. "Much more. But that would mean that I still care. And I don't care anymore." I slowly turned to the others. "I'm sorry for ruining your dinner," I said, already addressing everyone who was sitting around. "That wasn't my goal. But I couldn't let this farce continue. I couldn't stand watching them play the happy family act again, even though they betrayed me so easily and without regrets." There was a heavy pause, as if someone invisible was holding time by the throat. As I approached the door, the footsteps behind me became distinct. The first was Aunt Lucrezia. Then Uncle Paul, followed by cousins Mark and Sarah. And when I turned around, I saw that more than half of the table was empty. People were leaving. One by one. I went out first, feeling the cool evening air weave into my hair and penetrate the fabric of my coat. My heart felt lighter than ever before. I slept soundly that night, not waking up from heavy thoughts and memories. I got up early in the morning, packed my suitcase, and was already at the airport by lunchtime, waiting for my flight back. I left knowing that I would never return to this city again. There will be no casual visits, no holidays, no nostalgia for the streets of childhood. A week later, the phone rang. "Well, you certainly left an impression," Aunt Lucrezia said with a hoarse laugh. There was that same note of admiration in her voice that I'd only heard from her when I was young, when I won a school competition. "How are they?" I asked, not understanding why I needed to know. "Pretty bad." She didn't mince it. "None of the relatives speak to them anymore. Your mother called Jennifer yesterday to ask for money." Jennifer hung up the phone. "That's not my problem," I replied, looking at my neatly served lunch. "My father says that they are going to declare bankruptcy. The pension savings went into Gaspard's business. It's all for nothing." "It's not my problem anyway," I repeated with the same clarity and firmness that I'd said at the Thanksgiving table. "I just thought you should know," Lucrezia added softly. "What is it worth?" I asked again. "Maybe. But you're right. They had to face the consequences." 2 months later, a Christmas card arrived. Inside is a letter from my mother. It's long, messy, and confusing. Sometimes penitent, sometimes accusatory, sometimes almost pathetic. She wrote how sorry they were. How they miss you. How they fight for the house. How hard it is. They hope that I will remember that they are my family. I tore up the postcard before I finished reading it and threw the pieces in the trash. Some wounds don't heal. They remain scars that you can feel even after years. Some betrayals go so deep that forgiveness becomes impossible. But during these 7 years, I realized the main thing. Family is not those to whom you are connected by blood, but those who choose you and whom you choose. Write a comment on what you think about this story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. See you soon.